It's thinking about it. It's thinking about it.
Should I put this in? Should I put this on my? Oh no!
And yeah, I think we are live now. Oh
Hello.
my gosh, beautiful! We are all systems are a go.
I'm just gonna put this. We have a tweet about it, and I want to put the tweet on again.
Yeah, we had to let people know that this is fantastic. So, hello everybody, hello wonderful viewers. I am here with my esteemed guest, Trooper. I am like really thrilled to be finally talking with you. Oh. Did your audio just die on us? No, you're being quiet. Oh, something's going on. Something's going on. Ooh.
I fixed it. I fixed
it. There we go.
I fixed it. The thing is, no. What happened was that. Wait. So maybe it's not me. I don't think it's good. Me. It's not. So what happened was this. We were talking and I was like, great, we're cool. And then I started hearing all of the audio from the show. And I was like, there is a tab open on my computer that is not unmuted, that is having all of the audio of the show. And I didn't want it to,
Oh yeah, broadcast. I do that at least once. I do that all the time. No big deal. So anyway, back at it. So welcome, Trooper. Welcome. So I'm a big fan of your Twitter feed, first of all, right? Like you're one of the most thoughtful writers in the Twitter RPG space, which is extremely rare. You have these like long, detailed threads, sort of get into nuance, and they're philosophical and they're fun to read. And one other thing that really sort of caught my eye is I heard that you are running in a resistance RPG, like a World War II era resistance RPG. Is that correct?
That is correct. I am. It's called City of Light and Shadow because Paris is the city of light. And if you're a spy, you're in the shadows. So City of Light and Shadow. And we're just starting the 3rd season of that. And it's 16 episodes a season. So it's like been a year and a half now. And yeah, it's gritty. It's a spy, spy games are tricky because people have, okay, I'll just parenthetical. There are 2 different spy genres, let's say, canonically. Okay. There's probably more, but let's just say 2. The realist, so in my day job, I'm a professor. I teach music history and media, and I have a class called 1960s Spies in Music and Media, or the cultural politics of 1960s spies in music and media.
Oh my gosh, you're like a real expert. This is so cool.
Yeah, so we do like a lot of spy media we start in the 1950s before the spy genre really takes off. And we go through like basically 1960s when it really takes off. And it basically ends in 1974 with Watergate and Vietnam. When people were less excited about spies, and then we went to political thrillers is kind of how it went, and we came back to spies after 9/11. But so I'm just kind of looking at that moment, and for these 2 main competing threads in spy literature, there's the cinematic, sometimes called idealist, and then there's the realist. This does not mean that the realist genre is real and the idealist version is not real. It's just there are different themes going on, right? So in the idealist spy, classic would be James Bond, not the new films. In the idealist spy version, spies can trust the agency they work for. They usually have no negative impact for being a spy. Like you just go and you kill people. It's cool. Make a joke about it. Have some champagne. It's nice. And you like, it's great. Like it's a bit of a power fantasy. But it also doesn't tend to deal with like, if there are problems, it's usually not in being a spy or what you do or who you are.
It's an adventure story, and like that happens to star a spy, right?
Yeah. And then the realist genre is usually about, you usually cannot trust the agency you work for. You usually cannot trust yourself. Maybe you can trust yourself, maybe you can't. Usually the things that you do is like that work is dirty and it is problematic and it damages you psychologically. And it is like, there's like a lot of like real kind of like meditations on what this means. And if Ian Fleming, James Bond is like the typical sort of idealist spy, Jean Le Carré, like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Spy Who Came from the Cold, that sort of thing is like the typical realist spy genre. Side note, this is not what I'm going to say right now. What I'm going to say, I was going to just lead it right into RPGs, but what I'm going to say is actually, I'm going to get a slight detail. What is really fascinating about the new James Bond films, specifically Casino Royale, is that it takes the kind of emotional core of the realist spy genre.
The more like hard-boiled side,
yes, yes, because really, like, and I think you can really think about that. Like, pulp adventure is like the idealist, and then like noir, hard-boiled is like the realist.
Mm-hmm.
And they take that kind of emotional core of distrust and, you know, self-doubt and sort of difficulty of the realist, and they merge it with the action of the idealist. And that's kind of what sort of inspired by, I suppose, the Bourne films. That's what it's like a merging of those two things, which I think is super interesting, although they kind of walked it back. But so I wanted to run this espionage game, and I've been wanting to run it since 1988.
Wow, long time.
Yeah, and I didn't run it. I have been waiting for, I've been like gathering maps from World War II and all sorts of like details and data, but I didn't run it for decades because I didn't have the right players yet. And one of the tricky things is that when people think spies, they think Bond, and what they want is to like shoot somebody, make a quip, laugh, and then walk off. And I was like, that is not what I want to do.
You want to do like a slow burning, almost like political thriller.
Yeah, but also, I mean, sure, there's violence, but then it's also like, what does it mean to enact violence? Because the thing is, you can go and kill some people, but in World War II, what the Nazis did is they're like, oh, you just killed some people, we're going to round up 100 people and then shoot them and say that it's your fault. And then what do you do about that, right? So I really wanted to think about the psychological toll it takes to sort of enact violence or not, the fact that there were a lot of competing ideas about what to do in occupation. And I really wanted to highlight the fact that these were regular people who didn't have superpowers, who were not immune or magical. Like, they were like regular people who did amazing things, right? So I waited a long time.
Incredibly brave, amazing things. Yeah.
I mean, I always think personally, and this is just me, I think if Superman runs and flies into a burning building and saves all the orphans, that's great and heroic, right? But if a person who has no flight and does not have invulnerability and has no superpowers runs into an orphanage and saves all those children, that's way more heroic for me, because the danger is so much more real for them, and they could, you know, have not made it through. So I wanted to tell those stories, and to do that, I needed players who were cool playing people who were not superpowered and who wanted to play a game that sort of dealt with the psychological aspects of living under occupation and having to sort of think about, like, is violence the right answer here, and what are the consequences for that violence, and how do we think about the fact that we don't have food, and like really trying to, you know, work through a kind of a day-to-day life in a really tricky situation, but not giving up and doing it anyway. And I wanted people who would be ready for that, you know?
Diane in chat also brings up a similar point that the idea of Jason Bourne is sort of like this idea of what if James Bond had feelings?
Yes, yes.
Forced to deal with the sort of things of his actions.
That's right.
That would be, you know, sort of a psychopath and just sort of an outlet for, you know, male fantasy or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was always really, and so it took a while because, you know, our hobby is an interesting one, in the sense that our relationship to power in our hobby is tricky. It's a tricky thing. I mean,
what do you mean by that?
Well,
I'm intrigued now. I'm going to bite.
Okay. There's the answer that everyone will give, and I will say it, but then I'm going to take it back.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Oh, I like this already.
Right. So the answer that everyone would give is, well, I mean, our hobby is about power fantasy. Everyone who plays wants to play a power fantasy, right? I mean, like, it's D&D, you're throwing fireballs, and like, if I wanted to live in the real world, I would just live in the real world. I wouldn't play RPGs. That's what people say. And trust me, I've heard that a lot. I've heard that quite a lot, where people are like, yeah, why would I ever do those things? And the thing is that I don't think that's true. Right. I mean, and seriously, I've heard people say that all the time. Whenever I say, yeah, I'm going to run a historical game, because I have weirdly run a lot of them, people's response is like, why would I do that? Because if I wanted to live in the real world, then I would, you know, there's no fun in that. There's no, like, I want my escapism. I want to not live I want to live in a different world. Like, basically, you hear people like, if there's no magic, I don't want to play it. If there are no elves, I don't want to play it, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, one, you're not going to get a lot of power fantasy out of AD&D first edition being a first level character.
Mm-hmm.
There is no power fantasy in being the first couple of levels in old school D&D. You are less competent than people in the real world, is all I'm trying to say.
A cat will kill you.
A cat will kill you. And people who are not there That is not a joke. It is not a joke. Cats did scratch, scratch, bite, and scratches were both 1 point, and a bite was either 1 to 2. And if you were a magic user,
with a D4 hit die.
D4 hit die. Like, so, and you rolled it for first level, so you might roll a 1. And I think a bird could probably kill you. Like, it's bad. So clearly, you are not getting a fantasy, like power fantasy out of that. So I don't think that's necessarily true. Sure, it was in a fantastical space, but then also D&D is not the only game that existed in the old school. Call of Cthulhu was not a power fantasy in that way. Even Traveler, where you could die in character creation, again, right? There are a lot of games that were doing something different. And I think the idea that we only want power fantasies is not true. And I also would say that there are different ways to understand escapism. You can escape to all sorts of, like, people like horror films, and they also like dark films, and that is an escape, but it's just not an escape to a happy place, right? So I think that we do enjoy, sometimes we like sad things or horrible things. Sometimes we really like underdog stories. And I think that is a thing. I just had to find the right players. And then I found the right players who really wanted to deal with that. And it's been really good. It's been really good. I mean, I sometimes don't sleep enough because then I start getting on the internet and I'm like, oh, for example, it's not come up in game yet, but that's fine. Did you know, so exciting, that women, like let's say your grandma, perhaps, they did this thing, so cool. They would sit on their porches knitting, and they just like watch the things that's happening in the world, and they would knit, because knitting, you have a purl, like, like knit 1, purl 2, like there's like they're different stitches. They would knit Morse code into these scarves.
What?
They would be, yes. They'd watch troop movements, and they would just knit troop movements into their scarves through Morse code. And then they would send their scarves to their nephews in the UK. And then they'd have these code breakers undo the scarf and like read the Morse code and then get all the details about like troop movements.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
I know. It's so cool. I kind of can't handle how cool that is. So,
all right, so then I think that's a segue right there, right? So yes. If we're not talking about using the purpose of RPGs is not power fantasy, right? Then what are we getting out of then what are we getting out of using history as a framing device for our games? Because right there, like, I found something that's really, really cool, and my instincts, I want to share this with other people. And putting that in a game so they can experience that is a way that you can do that, right? It's cooler than reading it in a book or in a note when you actually do it yourself. So is that a way to use history, or how do you feel?
Oh gosh, by the way, I don't have chat because I had to shut down my browser. So I'm bringing up a different browser, which will not double the audio. So then I can have chat because I want to, because I care about chat. I was like, hey chat, how are you? I miss you. And that's what I want. There we go. So what I would say is, I think that it's important to note that even games that are not historical games usually use history in some way. And that is something that I think is really important to remember. That, I mean, I'm doing a historical game, but D&D is historical in its own way. And future games are usually not historical, but they usually are based on extrapolations of current real world implications. And so it's not like if you don't do historical, you're not engaging in history. You are. D&D is a quasi-medieval fantasy space, and so they are engaging with imaginations about medieval history. Most of those things are wrong, but which is fine. I'm not mad about it. But we're always engaging with history in some way. The question is just what history are we engaging with, why and how, and what are we doing with it?
And that's something we were talking about right before we started here. Like, what does realism in gaming mean?
Yeah.
Like, say that. Like, what do you think they mean? And like, what's maybe a better definition?
Well, realism is not what we're functioning off of, really. We're functioning off of what feels real, which is not the same thing as what is real. We're sort of dealing with fantasies of realness, or sort of verisimilitude, right? And there's a phrase for it. I'm going to say the phrase. It's probably wrong, but that's fine. It's the Tiffany problem.
What's that mean?
Well, do you know what one of the most popular names in the medieval time period was? It was Tiffany. Tiffany was an exceptionally popular name during the medieval era. but we do not imagine
No.
the name Tiffany as existing in the medieval era. So if I were playing an RPG or if I made a film and I had a character named Tiffany, people would be like, oh, that's so unrealistic. What is that? And it would like sort of take them out of the
space. Yeah.
the space. But it was a name that was super popular. So there's so many things you could do that did exist in the past, but that's not part of our imagination of the past. And so very often what people are doing when they're creating historical things is that they want your history to conform to their fantasy of what the past is rather than what it is.
Okay.
And so for me personally, I think it's important to interrogate, to know what the imagination is, and then know what things push against the imagination and decide when you want to push it, when you don't. I don't care if Tiffany's there or not. Like, I might just put it in there because I actually want to poke at people that way. And I get, like, I think one of the other ones that's a really big example of people not wanting something that was historically there because it doesn't fit their fantasy is guns. Guns existed in the Middle Ages. There were guns, but often people don't want guns in their medieval fantasy because it feels unhistorical to them, even though it's not, right? So, and I'm fine having guns or not having guns, that's fine. But on the other hand, recently there was a whole big deal about how there were no wheelchairs in the past, so we can't have wheelchairs. But it's like, but there were wheelchairs though. Like, wheelchairs did exist in the past. So like from the 1500s, I think. So the question becomes, when you are insisting on historical realism, what for, right? Because realism is often just sort of made up. So I think it becomes thinking about what you're including and what you're excluding and why. What are you valuing? Why? And do you want to do that? Mostly anything in the world probably happened. Like, do you know, I think this is funny.
Okay.
I think this is funny. So I teach music history, and a lot of my students tend to think that sex just was invented, like, I don't know, 10 years ago, and there really wasn't sex in the past in some kind of a way. And like, the music now is so sexy and wild, but in the past it was all, I don't know, Victorians.
Yeah, it was all prude.
Yeah, it was all prudish stuff. I was like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna play some stuff from the 20s, and then they lose their minds because that is not like, because there's some filthy, dirty stuff that happened always, and they lose their minds a little bit because it goes against their ideas. And I think it's important to push people that way a little bit, right? Like, no, you're not the only ones who thought about all these things, and a way to humanize the past and to let people know that all sorts of things existed. I think that's good. I think it's healthy. I think it does good work. So for me, it's just all about finding ways to bring in historical ideas that will be useful for your game and whatever it is that you're trying to do in that game.
Okay, so maybe a way of phrasing that would be is that what people have is not really an accurate, like a telescope into the past, right?
Right.
What they have is a conception, a story, a collective headcanon of what the past is. And so when people are really trying to talk about realism, they're really talking things that conform to that ideology.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Rather than doing things that are actually the way things would have been done in 1300s England.
Yeah. And also, hi Di, I can see chat now. I've got chat. I also think a lot about the ways in which we have these ideas, but we have to remember who made those ideas, right? Where did those ideas come from, and why? And I think that for me, everything for me is about sort of questioning where we get things and then deciding what we want to do once we've questioned it. And that doesn't mean you have to throw everything out, but just, I suppose, know what you're doing. I was on a website, there's a message board, and there was this whole big discussion about like how we don't want modern things in our RPGs. We want to be really historical in our fantasy RPGs. But what they meant when they said that was that they were really upset that the armor weights in this one book was like, they went on and on about like the D&D player's handbook and how much all the armor weighed, and also how there actually is there was like a long discussion about pole arms.
Yes, that's what I was about to talk about. That like there was this obsession with all these different pole arms, not because it added anything to the game, but because they wanted to flex their knowledge of real medieval history, because they were nerds and they thought it was cool and interesting. And so they wanted to take that coolness and somehow gamify it.
Yeah, it was important. But then I thought, and sometimes it's actually cool. Like sometimes I really appreciate some of those things. For example, there's this idea that if you're in plate mail, you can't move. And sometimes that gets put in the game and people are like, well, but actually you can move in well-fitted plate mail, not in like jousting tourney plate, but like regular functional plate mails.
Yeah, of course you could swing your sword. That was the whole point of it.
That was the whole point of it, right? And there was like people like doing jumping, what do you call them? Handstands, cartwheels in the plate mail, right? Right. And you're like, oh, right. So they were like, hold on, we feel like you're being sort of unfair to plate in a way that is not cool. Of course, we could have a discussion about how plate mail did not exist in the like early medieval time period, but again, right? So again, what is the part? But they want their plate mail, right? So they want the plate mail. They just don't want the dex penalties because that seems unfair to them. So it's all about sort of negotiating what parts of history you want and what parts of history you don't.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. It's a negotiation that you're dealing with as a player and a game designer.
Huh. Yeah. And I like that. And I think I think sometimes that people think that history is boring or that it will tie your hands. And I think there was a book that I read called Foregone Conclusions. And the argument was, it was about the Holocaust, but also a lot of the ways we talk about history. And the argument of the book was basically that when we talk about history, we talk about history as if it were a novel with a beginning, middle, and end. And so we end up tending to very often blaming people in the past for not seeing what was coming because it was foreshadowed, right? Because we're like, see here, there's this foreshadowing that happened here in this moment. So you could tell that this thing was going to happen. And then we end up kind of blaming people, especially victims, for not seeing these things. When, first off, people often didn't know things that we know now because history doesn't work that way. But more importantly, he argues, history is not fixed, right? Like time is not fixed. It's not inevitable that A will follow B when you're going through time. Right now, as we are sitting in this moment, we don't know what will happen in the future. Like we don't know. And many things could happen. Somebody who becomes a despot might not have become a despot. Any moment, all these things we live in could have. So I mean, like there were like in the first couple of years of Nazi Germany, there were like 40-something assassination attempts on Hitler. Any one of them could have succeeded. They didn't, but they could have. And so I also think that sometimes people feel like you can't do historical things because then you will be locked, like you'll have no player agency, right? Because you'll be locked into.
I see what you're saying.
Right.
But you're playing like a historical scenario, like, okay, you're expected to win. Okay, the Carthaginians have to lose at this Battle of Sicily, you know?
Right. And I was like, well, why? Because I mean, we're playing a game. We'll find out what happens. Like that's it. So I think that sometimes people feel like, oh, I don't want to do historicals because I have to follow history when you don't. Or I can't do this. I see this is so fascinating. I'm very fascinated by stumbling blocks people have. And one of them is, well, I can't play this historical game because I don't know anything about the 1940s. I can't, or I don't know anything about the 1820s. And I was like, well, you don't know anything about the Tau Zini Republic from the star cluster so-and-so.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and they're like, oh, but like I could make that up. And I was like, maybe you can, depends on your GM, right? Like, and you know what I mean? Like, I mean, some GMs are like, no, or it depends on the setting. Like, I know that there are some games are not historical, but they have 20 to 30 years worth of lore. And that can be, for some people, a barrier to entry because they're like, oh, well, you know.
I mean, that's why I don't play in Forgotten Realms. Yeah.
Right. Like, and there's an interesting tension because there are some people who are like, well, I don't really know anything about the Forgotten Realms, but I've got the book. I'm just going to go and play. It'll be fine. And then if everybody in your group is fine, that's cool. But if you're streaming it, there might be somebody who's like, oh, I'm sorry. Actually, the monarch of this small duchy right now is actually Princess Tiffany. And I cannot believe that you don't know that, right? Like there's certain fandoms will get very upset with you. But
that's an interesting point that you bring up right there. Like when people are playing historically themed games, there's somehow like a pressure or like they think it's somehow virtuous to go ahead and bring a layer of authenticity to that. And I think there's definitely something to be said about that because I think one of the benefits of playing like again, it's trying to focus on history is you're trying to learn something. It's maybe have an educational aspect.
That's right.
That's valid.
Yes, totally. Di said something really interesting. She said the idea being that you know the outcome, but no, you don't really know it. Not in this telling of the tale. Certainly, right, 100%. But also, I could see a very interesting game where the outcome is fixed. You know it, right? The players know it, you know it. Let's say you're going to do a campaign set on the Titanic. The Titanic is going to sink. That is true. But that doesn't mean the game is not going to be interesting. all that means is the game cannot be about stopping the Titanic from sinking. Instead, it's going to be about something else. It could be a murder mystery aboard the Titanic. It could be any number of things you could do, like on this, like you have from here to here, and then it's done. So do you survive becomes a question. Do the people you want to survive? Are you able to get something really important done before the end? So there's a lot of different ways to decide what your frame is. It's just about knowing what that frame is. And also you can just make up stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like you can just make up stuff. That's fine. It's okay. Like you don't have to know everything. Nobody knows everything. Just sort of pick the things that will feel right for you and the players and then go.
So are there any sort of like things that you think are like a real stickler for in the game that you're playing right now? You're playing this is like the French Renaissance or
French resistance in World War II.
So what sort of things are you're absolute sticklers for? Like, okay, we're fighting the Nazis. We're not fighting, the Soviets in 1945 Paris, right? 1946 Paris.
Yeah. That's tricky. That's okay. This is a tricky thing to ask because I'm weird. Right. That's it.
Well, so I'm pushing you. I'm trying to figure out, okay, where exactly is your boundary?
Yeah, no, that's a tricky one. So by the way, Notan is now putting Princess Tiffany in the campaign, and I'm here for it. So I think for me, there are some things that I'm like, ooh, about that, but it's not necessarily about history. Like as a GM, I am not going to necessarily knowingly introduce anachronistic things just because I don't care. I'm not going to do that. Two things. Here'll be my stickler things, and they're a little bit weird, but and they're also contradictory. But one is, let's say about attitudes. People will say, "Oh, well, today we don't have racism or sexism or homophobia or that kind of thing, but the past had all of that. And so I'm just not going to have it in the past because I just don't want it." And I was like, well, first off, we do have those things today. So that's weird. And so for example,
that's such a sticky issue. Yeah,
it is. Now I will say it depends on your campaign. There are campaigns where like, I just want to play a campaign where we're set in the 30s and I don't want to have to deal with those things at all. Let's go and have fun. I was like, cool. You know what I mean? Like, you can do that. That's fine. I'm into it. But at the same time, and this is like a weird little small thing, it's a small detail. In this, I'm like a minor stickler for this one, but I am less excited about bringing modern progressive attitudes to the past when what that does is erase past progressive attitudes. In the sense that in the past, there were also feminists. Because people were fighting, like if it's like 1910, women were fighting for the vote, right? Like there were suffragettes. There was like amazing feminism in 1920. It's just a little bit different from our feminism in like 2020. Just in the same way that like feminism in 2021 is different from feminism in 1970.
Oh, but in order to highlight that type of progressive heroism, you have to have the negative aspects of society around that, which means you have to have players that are comfortable with engaging with this.
Yes.
Misogynistic setting or whatever.
Right. And then also, of course, then we don't erase the work that people did in the past, right? So I like having attitudes of the past because sometimes they're cooler than ours. You know what I mean? And sometimes there are these really neat possibilities that we had in the past that we didn't go that route. And so it's kind of interesting to explore different ways of thinking about the past that were also cool. But also, the other thing is, this actually came up with the Game of Thrones. It was very interesting to me because there are a bunch of medievalists who are like, hold on, Game of Thrones. And like the idea being like, oh, it was the past. And so people got raped all the time. And these medievalists were like, no, actually, levels of sexual assault are not necessarily more than they are now. Do you know what they are now? Because they're not good. And the model was different. So actually, what we could actually learn something interesting by not just assuming, right, this thing, or like, what can we learn about other ways of being that are also interesting? And so there's a way in which, and I mean, also never ever use discrimination in the past as an excuse to just discriminate against your players, like to bully your players, like, and some people make that mistake. They're like, oh, well, if I'm going to do a game in the past, that means I have to bully my players. Like, you don't. There are lots of ways to sort of GM questionable attitudes that will not harass your players, as well as I think sometimes people don't understand that people who have chauvinistic ideas, oftentimes they don't just throw it in your face. oftentimes they don't tell it to you at all because people had, you know, weird senses of manners and chivalry. They still had those attitudes, but how it manifests isn't in the kind of caricature that we have today, which makes things more subtle and complicated. And you can do something really interesting with that in the game without harassing or making your players feel uncomfortable. And then also recognizing that the past is not monolithic. And I think about it all the time. I have people say things like, oh, well, you know, in the past, everybody was cool with slavery. And it was like, were they? They were not.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
like they're like
that's like the question right there. Like, could you do an Underground Railroad RPG?
Yes,
like, yeah, there's a way to do that that's respectfully for everyone
Yep.
involved, and there's also a way to do that. You just spring on the players, and then they make everyone really, really uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, that's why. I mean, personally, I'm always people talk about safety tools, right? And before they became codified, right, as they have been from the late 90s on, I suppose, most of the horror games I was in did a version of lines and veils, but not with those terms, but more like, hey, it's a horror game, you know, like checking it in on everyone. But also, I always just think it's important to have a pitch. Like to personally, I think it's important to have a pitch that you pitch to your players and get sign on. So you could say like, hey, I want to do an Underground Railroad game. Who's into it? And then you get people who buy in from the very beginning that they say, yeah, I want to do that. And then you're in a better space, but you like don't throw things at people. That's a little rude. But of course, that's not exclusive to historical games, but you have to think about it. And I'm thinking about an example of a thing that I think is really fascinating. There's a setting, GURPS, Steve Jackson Games has a setting, Banestorm, and it's their fantasy setting. I think it's quite fascinating, but the setup is there's a fantasy world, Earth with a Y. And on this fantasy world, there are elves, there are dwarves, there are orcs, and some other creatures. And the orcs are a problem because they don't live very long, but they, compared to dwarves and elves, but they are quite violent, according to dwarves and elves. They're expansionist, and they don't quite know what to do with them because there are a lot of them. They have a lot of kids. And the dark elves, who are genetically exactly the same as the regular elves, it's just that they're called dark elves because they have a different attitude. And that attitude is, we have an idea how to fix this problem, which involves a huge, huge ritual that will destroy all of the orcs. And so they made this big ritual to sort of fix this problem. And what the ritual did was it opened up a rip in time and space. And it brought, like in the 1400s, huge numbers of humans from our planet over to their planet, because humans also are expansionists and somewhat violent and also don't live long, but also, you know, so basically humans were brought into this world as well as a bunch of other creatures from different places. And then humans started fighting lots of orcs. So they're like, well, I suppose that worked because they're fighting over there and they're not coming into our forests. But so you end up getting like regular sort of influxes of sort of humans. So the game is a fantasy game, but you have actual our Earth people over there. And it's about like, oh, what happens to those people over time? And I know people who say they don't want to play in Banestorm for one reason, and that reason is that there are real world religions in that game. Because the people who came over from Earth are, you know, Catholic and Muslim and Jewish, and they're like, I don't want to play with real world religions in my game. And I was like, that's interesting, right? Because like that's just made them uncomfortable. And I was like, so, but they were totally fine with historical technology, with all this. Like it was very interesting, like where the problems showed up, right? And and then the other stickler thing for me, this is my stickler thing. One was that like basically I don't want to erase past interesting thoughts because we rushed too far. And the second stickler, and this is like my actual stickler, is tone. That's my actual stickler. It's not even really about historicity, it's about tone. That the tone of this game is supposed to be about, it's a bit of a more serious tone, and it's about consequences for actions, including consequences for violence. And so what would be a stickler for me, and this is the kind of thing I would vet ahead of time, and we talk about it. I would not want to have a player in this game who was like, you know what's awesome? Shooting Nazis in the face. I'm gonna shoot all the Nazis in the face. Woo, shooting Nazis in the face. And I was like, because here's the thing. It's not good for you to shoot people. Like psychologically, that damages you if you shoot lots of people. And a kind of laissez-faire attitude towards death and murder is a thing that I'm a stickler on. Also, I think the other thing that I'm a stickler on for this game specifically is there is a tendency and a habit that we do specifically about World War II, but not only, where in the context of World War II, we make Nazis cardboard villains, where they're all just like super 100% evil, and they twirl their mustache and they're not human, right? Somebody was, I was having a chat with somebody in my chat way before I started the game, and I was mentioning that I was going to run this game, and somebody said, "Oh, you can't do a World War II game." I mean, that would be like, I mean, World War II, you can't do an RPG about that. And I was like, there are 8,000 video games about World War II and films about World War II. I can do an RPG set in World War II. It'll be fine. And they're like, well, I suppose it'll be fine only if you show that Nazis are inhuman monsters. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. He's like, what, you love Nazis? Like, no, I do not love Nazis, but I think it is unhealthy to show Nazis as inhuman, because then once that's a kind of a distancing mechanic, right? Where we're like, oh, well, and this is one of the things that becomes tricky when it comes to RPGs, but like, because of, well, I'll get there. So if Nazis are inhuman, right? If they're utter monsters that are in no ways connected to
video games and movies, that's what they're there for, to be the inhuman monsters.
Yes, and then you can just shoot them and you're fine. But the problem is that if you do that, then you never have to worry about your own behavior, right? Because I'm not an inhuman monster, so I could never do those things. And so we're fine, except that the vast majority of people in Nazi Germany or the occupied territories were not Mengele, you know what I mean, or Goebbels. They were just a regular shopkeeper who, they saw somebody doing some anti-Nazi graffiti and they called the police. What's wrong with that? Or they didn't say anything. They just did their job. Like inhumanity is not propped up by like a supervillain. It's propped up by all of society who does nothing when it happens, right? And so I wanted to show the ways that this is not just a person that you can just like, oh, look, they're not us. And you're like, well, actually, in many ways, it is also us, right? And for me, there's that nuance that was important to me, because I want the players to have to think about, well, what do I do if it's my dad? What do I do if I say something, it will cause my friends to get shot? Do I say something? Do I not say something? And I think that it does more justice to the people who lived at that time, who really had to deal with really hard choices. And that may not be the game if you want to play Inglourious Bastards, the RPG. Like, I'm not running that campaign, and there's a space for that campaign as well. But for me, that was one of my sticklers, is that I did not want people to become white hats and good hats in a way that would sort of let ourselves off the hook in ways that I don't think we should let ourselves off the hook, and minimize really what was going on, right?
So I think that's a really good point there. And Felix is getting all sorts of interesting points here in chat.
Yes.
I'm reading all of them.
Oh no, it's so good.
Oh shit, I forgot what I was going to say. That's probably a big difference.
Yes. Felix, yes, I will not allow people to come into the game with Pierre Baguette Constant III, because it's a serious game. If you want to do comedy, this is not a comedy game. I can run a comedy game and then that's cool, but basically match the tone, right? This is the tone we're going for. You agree to match the tone, and so that's the one thing. But I do that at character creation, right? Like I'm a very open GM. I let players do what they want to do, but not at the beginning. Like when we're in character creation, that's when the heavy GM hand comes in most seriously. I was like, this is the tone that you agreed to and I agreed to. Pierre Croissant Baguette III does not fit that tone. I'm going to veto that name or that concept. Come up with something that fits. But once we start, like you've got all the agency you want. It's just that we've all agreed to do this tone, so we're in it.
So the other thing that he was talking about was, if every time you kill somebody, it becomes a moral quandary. Like, that's something that is very true in a historical themed game, like something that's very much tied to the real world.
Yeah.
As opposed to a fantasy heavy game where you can be sort of like lifted from those restrictions. Like I, run, pretty dramatic, pretty moral quandary heavy fantasy games, but at the same time, there's just, hordes of bad guys, go kill them, have your fun there.
Yeah.
And I think that you're right. If you're trying a history game, you're never really off the hook in that way.
That's right. That's right. And for me, that's important, right? And I there's been a lot of debate about intrinsic alignments, right? Intrinsically evil creatures in D&D, which I'm super against. Like, I think it's creepy. I don't like that somebody is somehow genetically or racially evil, but humans have no like racial alignment. Like, there's just things in there that I don't like, and I know what it's there for. What it's there for is that you get XP for killing things, and you want to be a good guy. So you want to be able to be a good guy and kill lots of things. And that's exactly what Nazis do in video games. Like they're just there for you to like, or zombies, right? Like there are all these things that you get to just kill en masse without ever having to think about it and still feel like you're a good guy, which I have a problem with. I feel like if you're like doing some mass murder of like entire hordes of things, maybe you should think about that a little bit. But I understand that in a game where originally you got XP for killing things, you might want things you can kill without feeling bad about it. And I get that sometimes people want to play that kind of a game. And so I just feel like you have to be a little bit more careful. Like I would say, don't do, these people are intrinsically evil and there's nothing you can do about it. And so it's okay to kill them. Instead, maybe like this group of people right here, this group of people are super, super bad. And so, you know, you could try to talk them out of it maybe, or you just need to kill them. But like, I think, and you can do that with historical things. You can also do that with, fantasy. Like you can bring that nuance into a fantasy game as well. And I often use historical thinking to nuance my fantasy games, right? Like I think about, okay, well, instead of this just being an evil empire, that seems not particularly nuanced. And I know we have to have bad guys to fight, that's cool, but, and I can make some bad people because they're bad people who've done bad things, but is everybody in that empire bad? Or is it the leadership of that empire that's bad? Is it the
attitudes of the average citizen that makes it possible? Is
like
that
what
really a problem?
Yeah.
Like
and
how much dark gray are you willing to tolerate?
Yeah. And what does that mean for the players, right? Because I think in the end, this is a weird thing, but I think about my responsibility to my players. And I don't know if it's responsible of me to set up a world where it's okay for them to slaughter children because those children are orcs. Like, I don't know if that's a responsible thing for me to do as a GM, to be like, sure, just set fire to those orc children. It's cool. So I feel like maybe I shouldn't do that. And so I would like to build a world that doesn't do that. That would be, and like, I get it. Like I do, like I get that some people just want to go and do some like good pulp punching ups. And I have run good pulp punchy ups, but I tend to frame them in such a way that you can do the punchy up and it's cool, but in a way that I don't think is like
just one
damaging.
beat. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yes, exactly.
All right. So let's change gears for a little bit. So let's talk about maybe like what parts, what role historical accuracy plays, like depending on where you are in timeline, right? Like if you were playing like a prehistory Stone Age, you can get away with a lot more nonsense than you were playing a game set in 1980, right?
Yes.
Do you feel like you have more responsibility, or is like your role as an educator, is that going to be any different depending on like what sort of time frame your game's trying to play?
So Good Society, the role-playing game, the Jane Austen role-playing game, has their pre-game session 0 questions they have to ask you about. And they say things like, hey, so for example, Regency was kind of sexist, and this is a game about like, there's a lot of sort of gender stuff in this game. Do you want this game to be like full realistic, semi-realistic, or not realistic? And they kind of give you ideas about how to deal with that. With historical accuracy, do you want to go full realism, quasi-realism, and then like no realism? Like where do you want to be? And there's a discussion about that. And I think their full realism was, we are going to be as historically accurate as we can. And that means that we might look up something at the table to make sure that we get it right. Middle is like, well, we'll do our best. We might get some things wrong. That's cool. And then like, we don't care. It's like, we're going to bring in like machine guns. We don't care. And I personally just think that knowing that no one can ever know everything about history, and there are things in our history books that are wrong, and multiple things happened at the same time, right? Some like in this part of the world, this was true, but in this other part of the world, this wasn't true. There's a lot of variety. I'm not that big of, I mean, look, I did this thing. It's not my fault. I get this way. I spent hours. I found it though. I spent hours, like I had the players land, an airplane landed to pick up the players and take them off, like in a Lysander plane that took them off back to Paris. And I was like, oh yeah, you have to bicycle like 50 miles outside of Paris to get to this landing strip. I came up with the number. And so we did, and after it was over, I was like, where was that landing strip? Now I need to know. So I went and I spent many hours on the internet, and then I found a document, because there are people who are very obsessive on the internet, it is true, that has the location of every single landing spot and disembarkment spot for every single SOE agent brought into France during World War II.
So
It's
cool.
like, it's this insane amount of entries. And I was like, okay, this is a 50-mile area. I need to find the coordinates of an actual landing strip that was used. I found one, by the way. It was a farm called Roger's Farm, and it's perfect. And now I have it, and I know exactly, and it's a historically true and accurate thing that I did afterwards. And that is a level of obsession that I feel like you just don't need to do at all. You really don't. But like, I do it as like it aids to things, but it's not going to stop anything. But you know, it's fine if you just wing it a little bit and you're like, oh, because here's the thing. Initially I just winged it, right? It turns out that what I said was true, but if I had never looked it up, it still would have been true anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, so like, there's so much that happened in the world that most of your wing is probably going to be fine. You know, like, I think that's the thing, that looking it up or not looking it up, it's fine. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not really the end of the world.
Well, then, did you really look it up for your players, or did you look it up so for you to feel inspired, for you to say, you know what, this is true. I can believe in this fiction, right?
Yeah.
Like, you hear about authors doing lots of research, like, why? Only like 5 things get on the page. Why'd you spend 10 hours reading that for that one sentence?
Right. And I think that for me, a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm a very improvisatorial GM.
Yeah.
I'm very much an improvisatorial.
So you
GM.
have to have the stock information.
Yeah. And I'm also very sandboxy as well. Right. So for me, I just need to know, I need to get certain things down, whether they're fictional or not fictional, so that when they go off the rails, because I really let the players do whatever they want, that I have a sense. And so me finding that airstrip, besides that being cool, I was like, oh, okay, so that airstrip is there on the map. There's this town and this town. So if they go and improvise, I know. So that's cool. So like, it just gives me tools with which to improvise, so that I don't, like, I look up almost nothing when we're in game, except I have a web page with weather from the time period. Now, point of order, you're like, why did you do that? I understand that seems very obsessive. Why am I looking at weather tables from 1941? It's a very easy answer. And that easy answer is this. As a GM, one of my things is that I very often forget about weather. I think it's really easy to forget about weather, unless obviously like, blizzard, right? You know what I mean? Like, but I was like, yeah, I sometimes forget, oh yeah, it's July. It's probably really hot and humid. You know what I mean? And so just having a historical weather table up it's not about the historicity. It's actually just about me reminding myself, oh, right, it's probably really humid right now and sticky. So I can just remember to sort of bring in those details. And I actually have done that for fantasy games. Like, well, I'll just like pull up the weather, like a weather report for a year, and then just sort of put that in my fantasy game, because I will sometimes forget, right? So for me, history you can use it for inspiration in ways that will sort of help you make a world feel lived in and real. Even if the world you're playing in has nothing historical in it, that 1 year's worth of weather was very useful. Because I was like, oh, right, yeah. Because, or like what time the sun sets. Like, because sometimes the players will ask you, well, what time does the sun set? And then I'm like, oh, I could just make things up, or I just have it right there. I'll just tell you.
Right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go one more question here. We're almost out of our allotted time. So one more question real fast. Why do you think people want to put history inside their games? Like, why do you think people seek a historical accuracy? Like, what purpose does it serve for them?
People have different motivations. I think there's a range of things. And I think one of them is, so I'm going to get big. This is the big meta. And this is why I actually think it's important to have diversity in your history, because our history shapes who we think we are now, who counts, who doesn't count. To be disconnected from history is terrible, right? In the sense that if you feel like you do not belong in this world because you have never been in the past, like you may belong here now, but if you did not exist in the past, that can be very alienating. And I think there's something really beautiful about being able to play something that has historical themes or inspirations, whether that is a fantasy game that is set in a fake world, but still has historical parts to it, or an actual historical game, to know that you existed or could have existed grounds you in a sense of society in a way that is very powerful. And I think that you could see that with, was it Battlefront? the one where there was a woman on the, it was World War II, they had a woman on the cover.
Yeah.
People were like, oh, that's so terrible. There weren't women who fought in World War II. And you're like, actually there were. And that was about who got to be a hero, right? And if you've always been told that you never got to be a hero in the past because you didn't exist, that's kind of alienating, you know? And
so we can have like trans people in our medieval fantasy game,
because they
whether
did
or not
exist.
whether or not there's a societal prejudice around them.
Yes.
You can play with it and play without it, but the important part is showing that you know what, these people did exist. They were there. They are part of our collective story of who all of us are.
That's right. That means we do exist, because people will often delegitimize you if they think you didn't exist, which is weird because clearly women existed, clearly people of color exist, clearly poor people existed. Like we did legitimize poor people all the time. And to be able to sort of place yourself back, like, no, there were working people that existed in the past. It's true, right? That allows you a kind of ownership of the present that is different than placing people in the future in a sci-fi game. Like if you have a sci-fi game that is full of all of this like diversity and interesting stuff, that's cool. But if they never exist in the past, that's right. There's something I think very important about knowing that a working class person or a person that has a prosthetic leg or whatever, that people existed and that they helped build the place that we are now. And I think that sort of bringing historicity into your games can give you that, as well as if what you want from your RP experience. So that's like the one big meta. And then like a smaller one is if what you want from your RP experience, which not everybody does, is to feel grounded in your character. Because like some games are very iconic, right? Like if you go like super pulp, like Flash Gordon does not have an inner life. You know what I mean? Nobody cares. Old school D&D, your character Biff dies, you just erase Biff, put in
GIF,
and then you go same character sheet, you just go right. Like if you don't care about the inner life of the character because it's never interesting, you don't care. But there's something really powerful about playing a game that's set in a place, it's either historical or not, and they give you a piece of food, right, that is historical, or they give you this little thing. Some of these like little details can just ground your character, and as a player that can help you make your character very real, even if what it is that you're complaining about are about pole arms, right? Or about the armor making process. Just the armor making process, getting that right, or imagination of right, can help ground your character in a way that can let you do player character work that can be really cool if you like that style of playing. So it's like you want that spice to give the players what they need to be able to inhabit the character in the way they want. And then as a GM, it's just like free GM tips. Like, I'm like, oh gosh, what am I going to do this season of City of Light and Shadow? I don't know. I'm like, oh, we're in August of 1941 and we're going to do a time skip of a couple months. That would bring us to December of 1941. And that's when Pearl Harbor happens. Okay, so if I start the game on December 7th, the day of Pearl Harbor, and that's how we start the season, that means that the United States comes into the war. That's okay. What can I do thematically with that? How's that going to change the world? So all of a sudden, I get a whole bunch of plot ideas, right? You know, just because I was like, oh, I can. Let me just take that. And so the past can give you really cool plot. I mean, all of Game of Thrones is the War of Roses. You know what I mean? Like you can just like you can pull. It helps you as a GM, and it can help you as a player sort of ground yourself, and it can give you different ideas. If you do, like, I like microhistory, like the history of like regular everyday working class people.
Oh yeah,
and
totally.
I just love that. And if you do that, you can get different kind of adventures than you would normally get. Normally it's like, big battles and generals, like, right. But there was a weird famine that happened in this town. Like what do you call them? Like, you know, the grain, there's a grain mold that causes everyone to have hallucinations.
Ergot.
Yeah, ergot. Like, oh, that's a thing. What if I have some ergot in my like D&D campaign? So we'll like all of a sudden you can like start pulling in, people think they bring in like our party's a cleric. Okay, so maybe we'll get like a bard will come in and find the party. There's a cleric there. Can you come in there's like demon possessions and you're a cleric, you can come in. And then actually it's ergot. Oh, that'd be really fun. And all of a sudden you can give them different kind of adventures than you would have normally thought about, just from these like kind of small little details, which really mixes it up and gives your players like really different experiences that are still fun, still cool, but they're not the same old because you are inspired from a different space.
Oh man. All right. Well, I think we're gonna have to end it there. Oh my gosh, this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming and chatting.
Okay, but wait.
Oh,
tell me about your banjo.
Tell me about my banjo.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can't leave without that. Come on.
Woo! So I got my banjo when I was in the Marine Corps, right? The
Nice.
person who lived in the barracks room next to me, right? He got it when he was home on leave. He's cleaning out his attic. He's like, "Yo, I think I know someone back at Camp Lejeune who might need a banjo." And they were absolutely right. So you can see, can you see that in the other corner right there, the little panda bear?
Yeah.
Banjo.
Yeah.
So for 3 years, I followed Fish around, like, and living in the parking lot, playing banjo, selling Jello shots off of that.
Okay. How cool is that? How cool is that? All right. I'm just going to throw this out there because you're in the Marine Corps and I was in the Army. I would, at some point, maybe we could have a conversation about doing military games because I find many gamers are like, "Oh, I would never want to do a military game because for the military, you're not allowed to think or do anything." I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's not true." So we could like, like there's a lot you can do, and I think it'd be really interesting because I know a lot of people.
We should get Anthony from Nazi Dracula Must Die.
Yeah,
He's in there too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. Well, everyone in chat, thank you so much. This will be up on YouTube for the next 24 hours and on my $1 Patreon. Link in the description. Until next time, let me know what you think in the comments below.
Bye.
All right, we're off air. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.